and welcome to another episode of Tech Fashion Special. My name is Gabriella Michael. Today's conversation is particularly close to the heart: storytelling. But not just any kind, the kind that echoes from the firesides of our ancestors and now, somehow, finds itself battling algorithms and even screen time. Which begs the question: how can we preserve African storytelling traditions in this digital age? A quick break and we'll find out. I'm talking about Ojiugo Uche. She's a media entrepreneur and the CEO of Genti Media, a platform using audio technology to preserve and also amplify African stories in a modern way. Please, Ojiugo, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure is ours. All right, so let's dive straight into it. But let's start a little bit on the surface. Let's take it down to where it all started. I want to know what's your earliest memory of storytelling, African storytelling. What's that earliest memory of it? Okay, because I'm trying to figure out if that memory kind of shaped how you view the relevance of African storytelling today.
I don't know if it's the earliest, but one of the dearest memories for me is being in the village. For us, growing up, we used to go to the village every Christmas, and it was a time of convening of my cousins, my aunties from all over the country coming together and spending a week and a half, 2 weeks together. And for me, my one of my aunts is almost like the storyteller of the family, and she would be telling, in a mix of English and Igbo, telling stories about us, about our own family, right? Reminding us of that time when I was young, and I used to suck, and they would tell me that a doctor was coming to cut off my arm, but in an amusing way, right? Telling different stories about
Yeah.
our own history as a family. And I think that's some of the dearest memories around storytelling for me.
Okay, so let me guess. This particular story has kind of shaped your interest in pushing out African storytelling using Genti Media, of course.
They were definitely a part of that. I think one of the things, due to some level of insecurity in my area in the East, we haven't gone back in the last 5 years. And one of those things, like craving, where can I hear more stories? Where can I hear more proverbs? Where can I get a feel of this? Even if, unfortunately, I'm spending this Christmas in Lagos. And I think that was a big part of me going out and looking and seeking for stories for myself, and then finding that there was such a, you know, dearth of such in available, easily accessible in the public. And that definitely was a part a part of the story, not the full story, but a part of what inspired me to start Genti.
Now, talking about how storytelling obviously has evolved in a world that's moving so fast with digital advancements and innovations here and there, and I think I would like to say digital distractions in some sort of way. Why do you actually think preserving oral tradition still matters?
Thank you. I think preservation is an interesting word, and I 100% I believe in preservation. But when people think of the word preservation, you're often thinking about, or what comes immediately to mind is preserving something that is past. But to be honest, like, we're also preserving what is here for the future. And so I think for me, why I think is important is because storytelling is as old as mankind, right? Storytelling is as old as our societies. We have always been telling stories. And when you look at the preserving of what has come before, we'll talk about what is currently here. But when you think about preserving what has come before, curating that, making that easily accessible, the fact is so many of our African storytelling is oral, right? We have rich oral traditions. Everywhere else has oral traditions, but I think, in terms of orthographies, um, writing in local languages, those have come, in the last century and a half for many African societies, right? Not saying that there aren't those that have that, but I think so. That is a big part of it. How do we preserve those oral traditions, oral stories that our elders know, that people know, and because we have a really, if you look at the greater breadth of time, right, writing is not as developed. I'll talk about, let's say, in the Igbo tradition. I know there are others that have a deeper one. Ajami writing for Hausa that has been more centuries, but there are a lot of places where writing is newer in the last 150 years. And so for me, that's important, right? People that may not read or write as much in Igbo, but speak it fluently. And how do we preserve those voices? And then when we come to today, right? I think the thing about it is culture changes, right? You have new slangs, new pidgin slangs every day, and pidgin is such a rich part of our current Nigerian culture, and these stories that we want to preserve for posterity, but also for people that are not here in the present, right? Is preserving it so that it can be listened across the diaspora anywhere. So I could talk about this for ages, but I'll pause there. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, definitely you have. All right, so you talked about the rich language of Pidgin and how versatile, obviously, and how it's more like that major language that anywhere you find yourself in the country, Nigeria, someone definitely understands what you're talking about. And which pushes me to actually ask this next question. I'm going to be using Pidgin to ask this one. So, for your view, let's talk about technology. As I promised, I was going to use Pidgin. So let's go back. What we talk about technology and how technology they actually help in the aspects of African storytelling. How you feel say technology don't actually help? You feel say they harm this African storytelling what we dey talk about, or you feel say they actually preserve them as much as we expect them to?
Thank you. I don't know whether my pigeon they flow like yours, so I beg you, you go allow me make I use English answer this one.
You're
I feel use
allowed. You're
English.
allowed.
Okay, thank you,
Definitely.
thank you. So, in terms
Yeah.
of how it's being used. So the thing about it is when we talk about technology is broad. So many things are technology. The writing system is a technology, right? To preserve. When we talk about radio, which has had such an impact on storytelling on the continent and across the world, right? But definitely on the continent, like rich radio drama traditions, spanning decades since the 1940s, right? So when we talk about technology, writing is a technology, right? And the even if it's in the last 150 years, the writing technology is coming online for a lot of languages. You have the radio coming online. So technology has and will always play a role. Now the technology is evolving. And so in the current sort of time we are, there has been the development of the MP3, been the development of, apps and smartphones. And so the thing about it is that, yes, the radio has the ability to um, to have people listen to audio across board, but then you only can listen to it at a particular time when that radio programming is on, right? And so with the advent of the smartphone, right, and being able to then have content on demand for people, how is it preserving? It's preserving because it's allowing people to listen regardless of what time they have, right? You don't have to wait for this particular time and be in this particular place or have access to, this particular radio station, right? It's it's breaking the barriers of time, of space as well, right? So, you know, Genti audio, we people are listening to us, have listened to us across 77 countries. So that is people across the world being able to have access to programming that many of them have been on the radio before, but this is not being constrained by time or space. So that's how it's having an impact.
So definitely it's preserving it and not damaging it as most as some people get to actually think. You know, a lot of people get to complain. And maybe I wouldn't say the Gen Zs are the ones complaining. The Gen Alphas, okay, the millennials are the ones always like we're westernizing a whole lot of things. This digital thing is taking the actual core of Africanism and even down to storytelling. Okay, so you're obviously not the ones who actually believe that it's weighing it down, but it's in a way actually developing things around.
Well, I mean, there's an argument to be made on both sides, but the thing about it is when we talk about digital, I think why
Mm,
people, I don't know the particular, well, the arguments to that effect. The thing about it is that digital media technology, what it does is exposes, right? It breaks the barriers of time and space, as I've said. So that means that now you have, you can be in Nigeria, you never set foot out of Nigeria, but you are being heavily influenced by a musician in Indonesia, right? A musician in Myanmar, right? An actor or an influencer in Malaysia, right? So this is, some of the people that I have on my social media, for example. And so, of course, those influences are going to affect. Now, to the extent where there are definitely like strong pulls from certain more dominant cultures. When I say dominant culture, because of the sort of economic pool they have, whether that's in Europe, whether that is in the US, right? There is, to an extent, people wanting to gravitate towards that. But at the same time, you have a situation where, because of technology, like let's look at the music scene, for example, right? You have the same thing happening in reverse, where Afrobeats, born and bred here, is having global effect and global influence. And so that's the advantage but potential disadvantage. Like it's not well, that's the play of digital media and how it affects and has the there's no barrier, so it can influence, right? And some have more or greater influence. But similarly, as I've given the example with Afrobeat, you have a situation where you have now, for example, through Genti Audio, right? Materials are being used by, whether it's people in the diaspora, whether it's Africans, people of African descent or not, who are trying to learn, you know, trying to learn Igbo, trying to learn Yoruba because of Afrobeats, and they're using the content on our platform, right, to immerse themselves digitally without having to transport themselves, to Lagos. So they're listening to stories in
mm,
Yoruba, they're listening to radio dramas in Yoruba, immersing themselves digitally. So it has a way of preserving, right, for other people, for ourselves, for posterity. But yes, there is always going to be that risk of, you know, being influenced and then beginning to say, well, what is mine versus what is someone else's. But that's the nature of life and cultural exchange, in my view.
okay, so you've actually put out some very interesting facts there, but still on technology and how it's preserving the authenticity of these African stories. Let's focus a little bit. Yeah, we've obviously seen the rise of podcast, of audiobooks, and then we've also seen the rise of AI narrations. I mean, it's very easy these days. Some creatives are no longer necessary, actually, when it has to do with audio productions and audio voiceovers. I mean, AI can literally do almost anything right now. So when we come down to the aspect of AI narration, because I also believe that Genti Media, from what I've seen, is also a platform for audio narrations, okay, of this African storytelling. So we've seen AI narrations. Now, I don't know if Genti Media also works on that route, but do you actually think that these tools, especially focusing on AI narration, it really enhances or dilutes the authenticity of African storytelling?
Um, I think I'll answer to the way I understood it, but I'll also then at the end maybe pose a question as well to maybe better understand what how we are defining of
Mm,
authenticity of African storytelling. But to answer the question about my view on AI narration and the landscape, Genti has experimented a bit with it. We produced three short story series with AI voices, though we also,
okay.
you know, again experimented with it, but we were not fully satisfied with some of it, and the reason being because as of now, a lot of what is available, the accents are not very good for Nigerian voices. So even when you're talking about English, right? So in English, you
Mm.
can, the technology out there that allows you to clone a voice, that allows you to use the voice for narration. And the thing is that that can help. So for us, for example, that has had some positives in terms of speeding up timeline of certain productions that we wanted to get out there fast. The accent is good enough, but it's not great, right? Because some of the things it still gives you sort of like an East African twang. Um, and then you also have the fact that you don't currently, right, through all our searches, maybe someone correct me if I'm wrong, but through all our searches, we don't have AI voicing capabilities for Pidgin. We don't have for Yoruba. We don't have for Igbo, right? So even if we wanted to experiment with those, we're not able to. Now, Google Translate, you can hear audio from in Hausa through that. Um, and I've just mentioned a few languages, but of course, we have over 500 in Nigeria. So the fact is that this is nowhere near ready to, take over from voice narration. But in terms of what is the ability for it to preserve, I think there's huge. I think even voice narration, it has a certain threat to for from a talent perspective, right? Because there's a question of, oh, there could have been voice talent that narrated those stories we used AI voicing for. But on the other hand, in order to even have the ability to do AI voice narration in a language, right? Let's say Igbo, where we don't have something robust available. In order to have something like that, what it would necessitate is there's a huge sort of data collection element, right? Data annotation element, getting of different voices, training the voice models, training the data models, and all of that forms a fantastic bank, right? An ability to do so much more in that language. There's so many potential benefits for that when we talk about education in local languages, because let's say, for example, if we had something like that, you don't need to manually translate so many uh, so many readily available courses in English to Igbo manually. Let's say for those who want to learn but their English is not as strong, right? You'll be able to use AI voicing to support that, right? To facilitate that, to speed that up. So for me, as much as there are certain threats from a labor perspective, I think as of now, the potential benefits and uses far outweigh the negatives. And so I'm very much for increasing the capability and capacity to be able to do voice narration. And the first step, we've not done that in so many languages, which is actually like building the data bank for that. That also acts as preservation, right? But also has the ability to like 10x, 20x, so many innovations in education, in language translation, right? In ability for people to understand new content in the voices and languages that they understand. Anyway, so I'll pause there, but I don't know if I quite answered the question because I believe my answer is a bit controversial potentially. So yeah, I'll curious to hear
But I
your
think you
view
hit
on
the
that.
nail. You hit the nail actually on the head because obviously, when you mentioned some of the test ones that you've carried out using the Genti audio app actually to carry out these translations. I mean, there's always the talk of can AI actually be able to translate these African stories? I'm not just trying to actually say paint a big, good picture in our heads, but we're talking about the language aspects. Okay, can they be able to tell the languages, speak the languages, as much as when an Igbo person, somebody from Nupe or somebody from Cross River State will actually be able to hear their language or hear a story being told in their language using AI translation and they feel or they can actually relate to that particular story and it doesn't look as if it's losing its touch or or that authentic language it's actually supposed to come with. So definitely you hit the nail on the head.
Great, great. I'm
Okay,
glad.
so now you talked about books earlier on, and you said we're going to touch on it later. So that actually brings me to this next question. I mean, African literature has long lived in books, okay? I mean, back in secondary school, we still read these books, and I mean, from the likes of Chinua Achebe to even Chimamanda. But now we are seeing a shift where these stories are being adapted into audio formats, pretty much like what you're doing at Genti Media. But do you think the transition from page to voice add a new dimension to how African stories are experienced? Because it's not just about listening; it's all about actually experiencing the whole thing while it's being told. Do you think actually this adds a new dimension to how African stories are experienced, or do we risk losing something in the process?
Thank you so much for that question. So, an emphatic yes, it adds to the experience, but it adds to the experience. There's a caveat there, which is the voices that are narrating the stories need to be true to the stories, right? With correct pronunciations for for words, for names, for places, right? That is important. And for so long, that's been something that's been lacking when we talk about conversion of audio for for conversion of books, African books into audio, right? But I'm very excited about the new wave where people are more conscious of this, and that's also having an effect on the labor market, right? Where people are paying attention and saying, if I'm going to have, you know, a book by Wole Soyinka, I need to get a voice narrator that can say the names right, right? And it's not going to I'm not going to use a British narrator, for example. And what we've seen even, right, is that also writers are becoming more specific and more particular also about that. We are excited at Genti Audio to actually have right now in Nigeria the exclusive audio distribution rights for Chimamanda's latest book, Dream Count. So Dream Count, the audio version of Dream Count is on the Genti Audio platform. And not only that, it's narrated by her featuring three others. And that is a testament to the importance of the voice that actually narrates it. So that's one example. But and so 100% yes, it adds to it. It the thing about audio is that you can be cleaning, you can be so I've been enjoying the book. You can be cleaning, you can be driving, you're still experiencing the story, right? But you also mentioned when you talked about African literature, you mentioned Chinua Achebe, you mentioned Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and there's so many others. But one thing I also want to highlight is that so much of the time when we talk more, in public spaces about African literature, a big part of African literature that is overlooked is African literature in our own languages, right? So Igbo stories in Igbo, Yoruba stories in Yoruba, Hausa stories in Hausa. And I think the Hausa landscape and audio story space is actually thriving, right? The Kanu market, the Kanu literature market, so Yaya literature, there are so much of that in audio. So that is a booming industry that many people do not recognize. Potentially by sales, it might actually be like the largest from a sales volume perspective in the country. But you also have when you talk about um, other languages, Chief Fagunwa, for example, who wrote several stories in Yoruba. You have Tony Ubese, you have FC Ogbalu, Peter Wana in Igbo. But what's the thing about those stories? The thing about those stories, we are also confronted again with the question of how many people actually read Igbo well, right? I know so many people who don't. You might be fluent in Igbo, right? I'm Igbo, so I can speak to that experience, but don't know how to read it properly. And so what you have is that certain of these literatures are actually being, they're not seeing the full breadth of listenership, of patronage that they could if they were in audio format. And that's also another important power that audio can have to expand, patronage of so many important stories. So thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for that one. That's truly amazing. And I'm definitely looking forward to listening to the Chimamanda's audiobook actually on Genti Media. So now, of course, Genti Media is one of the amazing platforms that are helping me imagine how African stories are being consumed using audio content, of course. From your experience so far, what have you noticed about the kind of stories people are gravitating towards to? What do they actually listen to the most? Okay, that's a kind of some sort of fact check here, using Genti Media. And what do you think these stories that people are getting really attracted to and gravitating towards to actually say about the evolving African identity in the digital age?
Thank you so much for that question. We recently concluded a survey, and we're trying to understand. Okay, there's what people have listened to and are listening to, and then there's also what they would like to listen to more. And in terms of what they would like to listen to more, there's just such a range, right? But some of the top ones that came out were romance, right? People wanted, or at least the people we interviewed wanted more, like to listen to romance. They also wanted religious content as well. But you also had things like, wanting to listen more to what's it called? Audio radio dramas. So there's in terms of if you look at the genre perspective, it's quite broad. Romance might top the list, but mystery, sports, there's a mix of it. But if you talk about some of the interesting insights from people actually listening on Genti, right? Genti, we have over 23,000 users on our platform. We've had you know um, we've had so many thousand hours of listenership. So when we look at what is driving listenership, right? What we see is that when we look at the plethora, when we look at the 1.5 million plus minutes of content that has been listened to on the Genti audio platform, we actually see that some of the genres that come up are Hausa. We had a huge push in the Hausa market, again, because of the content we had, um, and also the fact that that's a matured market in terms of people have been listening to this, are listening to this. So the Hausa content, we have quite a number of listening minutes based on that. But also now Pidgin stories as well are the second, right? So all our content that are in Pidgin with little push, they do very well, right? So I think
So,
this
what
what
does
this
this
speaks to,
actually say? Yeah, what
yes.
does this actually speak when it comes to, okay, how well are we doing so well, okay, in evolving African identities using this survey?
Yeah. So I think what this says is that storytelling, I think what it says to me is that storytelling, which has always been, will always be, and people continue to want to consume content that tells them and shows them themselves, right? That reflects back to them themselves. And from the language perspective as well, it tells us that people gravitate towards content in languages that resonate with them. So, and voices that
Oh,
resonate with them.
amazing.
Thank you.
That's definitely true. I totally agree with that one. I mean, why would I actually want to go try something totally new? Yeah, we all love to try something new. Everybody loves an adventure, but then there's always that thing that has to do with relatability, okay? Something we can always relate to, something that drives us back to our culture, something that drives us back to our languages. Pretty interesting. So before we get to wrap it up for today, I want to pick your mind a bit, okay? Because if there's anything I know about you, Ojigo, is that you love to try. Should I say try? No, you love to jump on adventures. You're this person that, from what I've seen, you love to dare yourself actually to try to do amazing things, and truly, you have always accomplished a lot from that. So let me ask, if you could design a perfect digital, let's say digital audio village, yeah, a village square for storytelling, what would it look and what would it sound like? I know this is kind of tricky, but just in few words, what would it look and sound like if we had a village square for African storytelling, but not just the normal one where we actually get to sit under the moonlight like we used to see it back then. But maybe it can be infused. But I'm talking about in the digital space that we are now. What would like digital African storytelling Village Square look and sound like?
It will sound like multitude of voices, multitude of tongues. So yes, it'll just be sounds coming from different places, stories from different places, ones that I've not heard before, and also the ability to, I think, go to different ones and have, I think, also hear a story and immediately understand it, or maybe hear a story and immediately be able to translate it to what I know and a language that resonates with my heart and a voice that resonates with me. So it will be multitudinous if this, yeah.
All right, Ojigo, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I mean, you've actually given us not just a window into the past, but the compass for the future, especially in the aspect of African storytelling. So, thank you so much for sharing all that with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been, an invigorating conversation. I love discussing these topics, and yeah, thank you.
So, to everyone listening, remember our stories aren't just content, they're identity, memory, and of course, resistance. So, whether you're actually listening through your phones or our voices, let's keep telling them and, of course, listening. Until another episode, don't forget to follow us across all socials. I remain your host, Gabriella Michael.